Good morning, everyone. I am Alicia Swamy, and I'm here with Keely Severson and Erik Johnson. We are exposing mold. Today, our Wellness Wednesday is on the November factor. Why you feel sick when the weather changes. We actually have a blog about this on our page, exposingmold.org/blog. I will post it in the comment section below in case you're interested in some more reading material after this conversation. So, Erik, this is the hot topic, it seems, in so many of the toxic mold and mold avoidance support groups. This is the time of the year that seems to unleash some sort of badness in the environment. They call it mystery toxin, hell toxin, etc. And we specifically call it the effect. Now, before we dive into the toxin versus the effect conversation, we are going to cover the November factor, also known as seasonal affective disorder by the medical establishment. So, Erik, maybe you can discuss a bit about the historical context behind this November factor.
Well, this is an observation that goes all the way back to Hippocrates. People have always been known to have greater ills and aches and even mortality in the colder, damper months. So, this has been recorded repeatedly throughout history without seemingly much effect to try to figure out what it is. Neurasthenia, the cold, damp east, affected people, and they were told, go west, go to the drier climates. When people got sick in Britain, they were told to move to tropical climates. So some kind of climatic effect has been reported throughout history. And so far as we know, no systematic effort was ever made to find out what it is. Well, the November factor is the name given to this by Dr. David Bell of Lyndonville after the 1985 Lyndonville syndrome outbreak, which later he changed the name to chronic fatigue syndrome, because that was the second well-known outbreak of what came to be called chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, during the Tahoe outbreak, the Lake Tahoe incident, I had my name for it. I realized that everybody was getting sick this way in the wintertime because I was getting sick and I could see it around me. And I had a really unpleasant name for it. I wanted to commit suicide, so I called it suicide season. But Dr. Bell put it in his book, Faces of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and described it as the November factor. And I thought, well, that was a much more pleasant sounding name. And since he was the first to get it in a book and connect it with the syndrome, I thought we should all adopt that and spread the word as to what it was. The observation was actually made by his receptionist secretary, Jean Pollard. Dr. Bell's very first patients with the flu that doesn't go away were the children, the daughters of his receptionist, Jean Pollard. So they just weren't recovering, and more people came staggering in with the same flu that never ends. And over time, by 1988, they had noticed that there was a pattern to this. And that pattern was that every fall, starting around October, these patients would start to relapse, or new people would come in with the mystery illness. And Dr. Bell put that in his book and said he doesn't know why this is, why there's a seasonal exacerbation. Is it lack of sunlight? Yeah, he connected with seasonal affective disorder. It's sad, lack of sunlight. Had everybody buying sun lamps, trying to get out more. That didn't do anything. And thanks to my experiments of going to the desert, I'd already realized by 1986 that I could control this by getting to a mold-free environment. So while Dr. Bell was following all the conventional explanations for November factor, I was trying to contact chronic fatigue syndrome researchers and tell them mold avoidance might alleviate this effect. So what do you think so far?
I have a question, or I want to ask you some questions if that's okay.
You bet.
I'm just curious, like, because we talk about how different changes in the weather have different, like it's not just cold and damp, it can be changes in the weather in general. But what do you think specifically is happening with the colder weather? Like, do you think the moisture's creating more mold spores? Do you think it's an atmospheric electrical change with cold coming in? Like, what do you think it is with the cold that's happening?
Well, prior to the 1985 Tahoe flu, I was already looking into this. And since we didn't have a viral culprit and nothing else was really standing out, there were a group of people who were studying atmospheric ions. They were studying the electrical changes in the atmosphere, the ratio of positive to negative ions. And this was actually a very popular theory back, well, in certain circles it was popular because it seemed to make sense. It seemed to account for it, that people are reacting to positive ions. And you know that good feeling that you get after a thunderstorm, the negative ions, where the friction of the atmosphere produces all these healthful negative ions? Well, it seemed like the effect preceding the thunderstorm, where people can sense the thunderstorm coming, is the prevalence of positive ions, which are oxidative and people really, the immune system doesn't like them very much. So it's basically just turning this around and connecting the thunderstorm, the weather change effect, to the seasonal effect when more storms are coming in and more of whatever's going on seems to be impacting the immune system.
Now, when if follower or watchers have been following us for a long time, they know that we talk about like contamination and things amping up, and some people might not be well versed in that conversation. But our personal experience between the three of us is that if something is slightly contaminated or even a little contaminated, when this amp up occurs with this like weather shift coming in, these items can suddenly bother us more. And so things can amp up maybe a couple days before a storm as the atmospheric electricity seems to shift. Like, we don't really know. This is obviously a theory. I don't mean to state it as a fact, but I want to preface this in terms of discussing like MT and hell toxin and these things that people run into or these things that amp up, because is it possible that what we call the effect, because it can change in behavior with symptoms, that other people are misconstruing for these like specific toxins that they're naming, and is that confusing them along their journey?
Well, during the Lake Tahoe mystery illness, I reported that I saw strange atmospheric changes, specifically lightning. The lightning just went crazy. All the time I was growing up at Lake Tahoe, we had sheer vertical pillar, straight up and down bolts of lightning. And something changed in the atmosphere so that all the lightning was thin and crackly going sideways, and there was lightning everywhere. There was so much of it. And this told me that there was an excess of charged particles in the atmosphere. And since we didn't really have any good culprits for the Lake Tahoe mystery illness that was striking all across the north shore of Lake Tahoe, it seemed natural to look for what changed, and something in the atmosphere changed in a really big way, the ratio of charged particles. Thanks to my interest in the atmospheric ion effects, I focused in on that and started looking for clues that might substantiate it. And it seemed to me that if this oxidative reaction was damaging to the lungs and bothering people, that it might open a window of vulnerability to toxins, anything that's normally in your environment, but you can't feel it because your lungs are working properly and they're protecting you against it. Well, during this incident in 1985, people started pointing at every volatile, every fume, every airborne toxin that you can imagine. Volcanic fumes, pesticides, dryer sheets, the gasoline fumes at the station. People would try to pull in to get some gas and just get sick from the gas fumes. If it was something in the air, they were pointing at it. So when people started making up names saying, well, I believe that this is the toxin that's affecting me, I could look at the overall pattern and go, it's all of them. No matter what it is, if it's in the air, it's bothering you. If you start making up names for the dryer sheet toxin or the, you know, petroleum distillate toxin or the pesticide toxin.
The downy death toxin.
The what?
The downy death toxin.
Yeah.
DDT.
Well, you know, it was really amazing how people reacted so strongly to the fumes from detergents and dryer sheets. But they would fixate on that and go, okay, well, this is detergent, airborne detergent toxin. And I could look at this overall pattern and go, it's all of them. All of these different volatiles suddenly became bioavailable. So I wanted to watch, if you give something a name that connotes the mysterious nature of it, mystery toxin, well, that means you're going to look into it. We got an ultralight passing overhead. 2 of them. Cool.
What's an ultralight?
It's the hang glider with the engines.
Oh man, that's cool.
I don't know if you can hear them. They're
I can hear them.
information.
Yeah.
So I wondered if people would concentrate on any particular name of a toxin to go, okay, well, it doesn't fit in this context. There's something about it that is beyond a normal toxin. It requires a catalyst, some kind of vector, some reason for it to become bioavailable. But as time went along, I didn't see any evidence of that. People would make up a name, freeze that name as if they invented a name for dryer sheet toxin, and that was the end of it. There was no further investigation. So they weren't stepping beyond to see the pattern that all of these had become more bioavailable. So I realized that the way the mind conceptualizes a toxin, it frames it as a chemical, it frames it as a volatile, it freezes the concept on what we already know about it and stops all curiosity from that point. So I realized, well, I can't do that. I can't give it a name. I'll have to call it the badness or the stuff or the effect, to create just enough mystery about it so that people ask, what do you mean by that? Why do you call it an effect instead of dryer sheet toxin? And then I could explain that something happened in the atmosphere that made it more bioavailable. And that's the bottom, that's the real cause, the root cause of why these things are bothering us now when they didn't used to.
Do you think because of this complexity to view it in this manner makes people default to toxins instead of viewing this overall effect, this atmospheric shift and change in the ions? Does it just seem too complex for people to understand?
Yeah, that's exactly it. People freeze, they lock up on a particular idea, and once that becomes embedded, then it's unquestioned. It's a predicate. They if they see another effect, then they look at that as a separate effect and don't compare the two to go, what does the dry cleaning agent that people were complaining about, or the cleaning solvent, or the dryer sheets, what do all these have in common? And what they did is they all became harmful at the same time. People started complaining about them at the same time, even though the concentrations of these hadn't changed. It was something that made them more bioavailable.
You always discuss like nanoparticles as being the issue and them carrying their own amount of surface energy, and that's sort of what we're reacting to. Do toxins carry the similar type of surface energy?
Well, some low molecular weight toxins do have their own surface energy, and I don't know exactly what properties they have. But the way this concept got going is when I saw the charged particle effect, the lightning in Incline Village, I asked what was going on, and we were being doused with silver iodide cloud seeding. the ski resorts were dispersing silver iodide particles as a nucleating agent to try to capture more precipitation, get more snow, and increase profits. And we were terribly concerned about this because we don't know what silver iodide, these little heavy metal particles, are going to do to our environment or what they're going to do to us. And there doesn't seem to be much in the literature explaining just exactly what they're doing. But what we do know is that as a nucleating agent, as something that has surface energy with this attractant property that causes water molecules to condense and then precipitate in the form of rain and snow, we do know that it attracts stuff. So that means it's going to attract toxins, acid rain, pesticides. Anything that's in the atmosphere is going to stick to that and come down and rain on us. And for the first time, we started thinking of snow as maybe not so pure, maybe as being toxic. Because if that snow has a silver iodide nucleus that is attracting all this garbage out of the air, then it's concentrating it and raining it down on us. And maybe we could be breathing it. Maybe it's getting into our water. Maybe it's laying all over the ground. And perhaps when there's a change in the weather that's causing these things to become more reactive, we're sensing it. So the nanoparticle theory is simply an offshoot of the observation that we're being doused with cloud seeding during the 1985 Lake Tahoe mystery illness. And even though I realize that the rest of the world is not being dusted with these same types of particles, we do know that nanoparticle pollution is increasing. So maybe Lake Tahoe was just a spectacular example of this effect, but it's happening at a lower level all over the world.
So you mentioned that toxins are, whatever chemicals that have been going into the environment haven't changed, right? There's been a consistent flow of chemicals in our environment, and it's really the nanoparticles that make these chemicals bioavailable because they attach to the nanoparticles. Is this the reason you think for varying symptoms that people have? Like some people will say they'll go into an area where there was a forest fire and say that frat is causing them issues. Is it simply the frat, or is it maybe there's a high concentration of nanoparticles attaching to the frat or whatever, the toxin, and then causing varying symptoms?
Well, in areas where there was an increase in chemical toxicity, it's you can blame that and then forget about the vector, forget about the effect, kind of set it aside that it there's no signs of it being bioavailable. What made Lake Tahoe spectacular is that all the things that people pointed at had not increased in concentration. So that demanded that you postulate an effect of some kind. Now, when an area's been, a forest fire has been put out with flame retardant, and then people complain about that, I do believe that it's very, very possible that it's a combination of the nanoparticle effect, the vector transport effect, plus that flame retardant. But it's not as good of an example to use because people just blame the flame retardant, lock that in their mind, and look no further.
What was interesting to me is when we spoke to Dr. Charlie Swanton in our latest episode 88 of the Exposing Mold podcast, he was mentioning how air pollution, these ultrafine organic materials, metals, the body can't dispose of these things. We don't have the ability to dispose of this. So the body's natural response when we're, inhaling this stuff is basically a cytokine inflammatory response. Do you think this has some plausibility with SIRS, with Shoemaker's chronic inflammatory response syndrome, that this in fact is actually an issue of nanoparticles?
I do, except I didn't know what direction Dr. Shoemaker was going to go with SIRS. For many years, almost 20 years, he seemed intent on connecting toxic mold with chronic fatigue syndrome, drawing attention to this, which would be a way to open the discussion. But then in 2019, he backed away from mycotoxins. He lost his focus on mold and expressed SIRS. He always did say that it was kind of a toxic soup of anything and everything, from Pfiesteria to brown recluse spider bites to Lyme disease. But at least he had this project that he was helping me with of telling the chronic fatigue syndrome world about the specific factors that happened at Lake Tahoe. And then that dropped away. So now when they talk about SIRS and it's lost this focus on mycotoxins and it's become such a vague morass of anything and everything, I don't even know what to think about it. I don't know what he's describing. Yes, it's an inflammatory response and a generalized one, and he doesn't seem to have much explanation for it. So it could very well be the overall nanoparticle effect, but without any specific clusters to examine, without particular people or an incident or something where you can connect the dots, the rubber doesn't meet the road. There's no traction in that because it's simply too vague, and you can't follow the chain of evidence from observation all the way to a testable hypothesis.
Thank you for that, Eric. Considering that we had interviewed Dr. Michael Lawler from the NOAA and also Dr. David Lewis, who they've done studies on particulate matter and stuff in the atmosphere, Dr. Lawler's team discovered fungal shrapnel in the atmosphere. So is it really safe to say, I know that we're always bouncing through toxins and mold avoidance gets really confusing because people think that it's not actually mold, it's just things that are irritating the body. I mean, is it safe to say that fungal particles are indeed the issue and not necessarily the toxins, or is it all an issue because of the introduction of nanoparticles?
Well, that fungal shrapnel name, that's spectacular. I mean, that's attention getting. And yeah, they found that in the atmosphere where they had anticipated that the primary phenomenon was nucleation, the condensation, the coming together of all these particles into aggregates, they found that it was the opposite, that when, in terms of fungal particles, they were splitting up into their individual nanoparticle form, which are the more pathogenic ones because they can pass through the lungs into the blood and brain. There's nothing to stop them. They're so small and they've got a surface energy that gives them a unique property of kind of dancing away from everything in our lungs that would catch them. So yeah, fungal shrapnel is a terrific name for that. But I read many years ago that fungi have the ability to process nanoparticles, especially silver nanoparticles. You can imagine how that caught my attention. Here I'm looking for a reason why all the sick buildings, the sick moldy buildings, suddenly lashed out with new pathogenesis during the Tahoe incident. And now I'm finding that the very agent we suspected, the silver iodide, can be processed by fungi. It can be collected. It can be packaged into a tight little spore where the outside of the spore is coated with nanoparticles. So now you're getting an extremely high dose of something that they said wasn't harmful because it was so widely diluted. They said, yes, silver iodide, it's damaging, but it will be so dispersed, so diluted that it can't possibly harm anybody. Well, here's a mechanism, an organism in our houses, in our environment, that has the exact capability of collecting, condensing, and emitting high concentrations of nanoparticles. And that is exactly the agent that we were pointing at during the outbreak. So I thought that is certainly enough evidence to warrant looking at fungal colonies to see if they've increased their production of nanoparticles. And this is the real reason for their enhanced pathogenesis.
Sorry. Thank you for that, Eric. I really do appreciate that. Now, those that are hypersensitive really have to live and die by decontamination strategies. Like we are the peanut reactors. Mere molecules of this stuff can literally send us into anaphylaxis or even give us a heart attack, for Christ's sake. So how and why does this stuff become so sticky? Like what's going on with the nanoparticle and the mold? Why do we have to decontaminate to lessen health damage?
Well, the whole concept of the cloud seeding was nucleation, the attractant quality. And if you think about the mold toxins that Dr. Shoemaker was describing, what, this squirrel's laughing at me? Yeah, they're trying to hit me with pine cones, and if they don't make it, it's like they're pissed off. So, so the whole concept of nanoparticles is about attraction and sticking to things. Dr. Shoemaker's cholestyramine concept is that the positive charge of this anion exchange resin, this little plastic pellet that you ingest so that it passes through your lungs, it's going to be like little super magnets. And it will lock onto the net negative charge of the ionophore mycotoxins, stick to the little pellet, and then you'll crap it out rather than reabsorb it. So you're binding the toxin and getting rid of it in this way. And it just seemed to me, well, if the fungal spores have nanoparticles with this charge, that's going to give them a lot of electrostatic power and make them stick to everything. And the associated toxins are going to stick to everything like glue. And they're not going to be mechanically dislodged because the submolecular bonding is so tight that no matter how you scrape away at them, these little devils are going to be molecularly bonded onto the surface to which they are attracted. So yeah, our anecdotal observations are that when you encounter the bad stuff, the effect, whatever this incredibly sticky, nasty, cross-contaminating stuff is, it bonds to things with a tenacity that people who have a particulate mindset, they can't even comprehend. We talk about toxins sticking to plastic, ceramic, even metal, and we can't wash it off. And they go, well, that's impossible because it's a fragment, so you should be able to easily wash it off. Well, that doesn't fit what we observe and what we report.
I really would love to have Keely describe her recent experience with her mom's sheets, because that was a great example of one supercharged contaminated item that she discovered that helped her kind of reduce her symptoms.
You know, I'm listening to you guys and I'm like, there's so many stories we could tell to set examples about this, because like we've behind the scenes together, like try to navigate all this drama. But essentially my mom lives in like a suite in our basement, and we did have an issue with a washing machine having like a sewage smell, and the whole washing machine did need to be replaced. There was like some confusion of like, is all of the clothes and laundry going bad for another reason, which I do think there was a separate issue of cross contamination with the truck. But the laundry machine like tipped our clothes and sheets over tolerance to the point where it became a big problem, and new clothes were getting ruined, new sheets were getting ruined like really quickly. I was to the point where I wasn't able to really walk through the downstairs because I was reacting awfully and I didn't enjoy being down there. And if you've been a mold avoider dealing with contamination, you know that it's always a sore spot with loved ones to tell them to get rid of their stuff if it's contaminated. And so, of course, this has been like an issue with my mom, because when she moved in, literally everything she had was contaminated. So it's a sore spot. People feel like you're telling them like, hey, you're dirty or gross or something, and that's just not what it is. But they just don't have this understanding. So this big fight about contamination in the downstairs, and I thought it was all of her clothes from the washing machine, because it was like every time my kids were going down there and giving her a hug, it's like they're coming up and they're reacting. So what's getting all over them? What is sticking to them when they come upstairs? I can feel it in their hair. I can feel it on their clothes. I have to decon them before bed sometimes. I finally went down and started like really going through her stuff and investigating. And I noticed her sheets were so killer that I honestly could not comprehend how she was sleeping on them without being sick or even without having insomnia. So I got her new sheets and I replaced the sheets and took the old sheets off. And even though the clothes that were in her room had always kind of bothered me from the washer, once I got those sheets out of there, which were bothering me much less or much more than the clothes, it's like the charge of the clothes or whatever was on the clothes, whatever I was reacting to on the clothes, suddenly became a much lesser level. And I'm telling you, my mom would wear these clothes in the kitchen and I have to leave the room because I feel like I'm having a heart attack. And that's like a really awkward way to have dinner every night as a family. I'm just letting you know. And then I started reacting to the clothes less, to the point where, you know, I can be within 5-10 feet of her now without feeling a lot of that heart stuff. I do still feel it, but it went down so much. And the only thing that has changed, there's two things that changed. The weather has cooled off here, which Erik has explained to us can reduce some of the volatileness of it, which I know is confusing in terms of the November factor of like an incoming storm. But the other thing, Erik, can you explain what you think maybe happened with removing the more contaminated item?
Well, we know there's physical biochemical laws of colloids, of charged particles in a liquid that have been very mysterious and little studied and little understood. In fact, we just found out about a new one called proton jumping, where a new way of looking at how charged particles behave in a liquid make them actually create a little pathway for themselves, like lightning, very much like lightning. So as the surface energy is discharged, if you can imagine like a sparkler sending out a little spark, it leaves a trail. And from that point on, that trail becomes like a lightning rod. So the ambient levels of electrical potential in the air now form like a lightning, a little bit of lightning coming from one object to another. And I'm sure a lot of people with mold illness have seen the effect they have on sheets, where they can create static like crazy. I mean, it's amazing what a light show mold injured people can put out. And it seems to me that when this effect is in play and we're like sparklers, or contaminated objects are like sparklers, that electrochemical effect can bring out toxicity even at a distance of other contaminated objects, because they're connected by this proton jumping and the electrical chains through the colloid. And air is basically a colloid. So I know it sounds kind of crazy, but the point of this whole thing is that if an observation doesn't fit the conventional explanation, always look for something new, something that might explain it. Don't make it supernatural. Don't call it vampire energy or just describe it to ghosts. Look in physics to see if there's anything that might explain it. If there is, let's pursue it.
Remember when I was driving through that highway in Tahoe and I was stopped because they were doing road construction, and all of a sudden, like, I thought I was having a heart attack, and I told you guys I had to turn around, and I thought it was because of something that was happening. The cars were spewing out, you know, whatever. There was a bunch of cars idling, and whatever's coming out of their catalytic converters were affecting me. Like, sometimes these moments that we go through really stick in our mind, and then we think like, oh, it was the cars. Imagine if I took that experience and just attribute my issue to car exhaust. I would never want to drive again. I would never want to do anything again. And I think people get stuck in these fear patterns where they glom onto a toxin or a substance, and they're like, I'm so scared, I'm so triggered, I'm so traumatized by this, with reason, right? They're having these symptoms that are scary. But it's like, once you start running these experiments, you understand that there's actually an overall effect, right? So when I had that issue, I sat down with you guys and we broke it down. And Erik mentioned the Venturi effect, which we have talked extensively in our Exposing Mold members group. If you guys are interested, check out patreon.com/exposing mold to join that conversation and learn more about that. But because of these different effects, it made more sense to me. And that fear factor of, oh my God, I can't be in traffic anymore, went away. So we see this playing out in the community where people get really fearful, and it seems like the effect is a much I mean, it still sucks, right? It still sucks that we go through this, but it's a much more strategized way to kind of look at what's going on, instead of just associating your symptoms to one toxin or multiple toxins, or feeling like the world is killing you because everything is affecting you.
Well, you can't avoid every toxin because we do live in a toxic world, but you can avoid the effect. And I think that's the point here is mold avoidance is learning to feel the effect and learning to stay the hell out of its way.
Yeah, I mean, to break it down, the effect is basically a sudden enhanced bioavailability due to atmospheric nanoparticle effects, qualities, how they behave. And I was able to make predictions based on how I think, how my model of this works, in that they're going to stick to objects like crazy, amp up when the weather changes. And that allows me to go, oh, yeah, this is acting up because the weather's changing, a cold front is coming in, but I can feel it has a certain range around this contaminated object. That was my mistake. I brought in this contaminated thing, so I'll take it back out and boom, I'm good again.
And that's something that you always preach, Eric, is like reducing the health effect of an item that's affecting you. Like the longer that you're staying around it, the more health damage you could be incurring. So getting it out of the way, if you know an item that is affecting you, is definitely going to lessen that damage and help you, hopefully, if we're speaking in terms of nighttime, get better sleep, because sleep is the time of regeneration. Go ahead, Keely. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's okay. I'm excited to tell you guys something, but I don't know if this is the place. I'm like chomping at the bit.
I do have a few more questions for Eric, actually, before we go, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Everyone watching wants more questions. I do have a few more. We did mention, and this is something I had issues with in the beginning. I don't know why. Sometimes I'm, brain dead to certain things. There's a difference between a cold front and the cold, and how those two differences, one can make you feel better and the other one can make you feel worse. Can you give us the nutshell version, Eric?
Well, when I talk about a weather change or a cold front or the atmospheric effect, I'm talking about overall triboelectric or tribostatic friction of the entire atmosphere changing its qualities, its positive to negative ion ratio, where the air is being stirred up at a high altitude and altering the differential between earth ground and electricity in the sky. So the weather change effect is a huge effect. I mean, it goes all the way up to the extent of the atmosphere, even possibly the magnetosphere. And getting cold is a localized effect of just the temperature without that, independently of what's going on with the atmosphere, where the shift in temperature can reduce volatility. When things become gaseous, when they turn to fumes, especially formaldehyde is extremely well known for increasing its concentration geometrically with an increase in temperature. It doesn't just come up mathematically with a little bit more for every 10 degrees of increase in temperature. It increases like 50 times over what it was. So they even tell people, if you live in a place with lots of formaldehyde, try to keep the temperature down so that this won't volatilize and you'll be breathing less. So I believe that the effect of cold, how it sometimes makes feel better, is just reducing volatility on a local level. But that is a completely separate situation from whatever the atmosphere is doing during a weather change.
Thank you for that description, Eric. I really do appreciate that. You had briefly mentioned this. Pardon me. Good Lord, sorry. My singing voice is crackling today. So you'd mentioned earlier about the varying symptoms, and you and I had a conversation over pizza or some kind of food. We've eaten a lot of food over the past few weeks together about the varying symptoms, and you had mentioned something about receptors. I would love to just know more about why people have varying symptoms in different environments. Oh, wait, what your thoughts are.
Well, when your immune system is turned off and the pathogens reactivate, you'll have different symptoms according to whatever your particular bug load is. And so no two people are going to be the same if their immune system is suddenly switched off. We saw that in the AIDS days. In fact, this created a lot of confusion because they said, well, AIDS must be a combination of toxic soup, stress, lifestyle, general failure of immune system for no apparent reason that they could find. And yet the Kaposi sarcoma and the molluscum contagiosum and the various symptoms that came out, the various infections that showed up, were all over the map. So we kind of see that to a certain extent with chronic fatigue syndrome, is that people are all complaining about something else. And sure enough, the very first immunological observation in chronic fatigue syndrome was, gee, how'd it get so dusty? That we had low natural killer cell function, that our natural killer cells were somewhat confused, not acting up to par. And the theme of Dr. Peterson, Dr. Cheney, Dr. Komaroff in the early days was to focus on this loss of immune function. And somehow along the line, they seem to have forgotten about that and switched chronic fatigue syndrome into being primarily fatigue, as if we gave a damn about fatigue in light of all these various immunological failures that we're having. So if I trace this back to the nanoparticle effect, the protein synthesis inhibition of mycotoxins, how we're going through a certain level of immune failure, then yeah, everybody's going to have different symptoms. And then in addition to that, you've probably heard about the ion channelopathy reported by Dr. Gradisnik at Griffith University. Well, depending on what ion channels are bound up, you're going to have different pathways affected and different symptoms, either neurological or systemic or autonomic, all depending on the prevalence of these ion channels that are impeded. And if we accept that what's going on are an increase in ion channel blockers, then it stands to reason that it's the same thing. Different pathways, different symptoms.
Yeah, because I always see people, I think we lost Keely. I'm sure she'll come back. We always see people, well, I see people in the groups always attributing different symptoms to different toxins. Like, oh, frat makes me feel dizzy and whatever. And oh, HT makes me feel like I'm burning. And, so it's, your description definitely kind of breaks that down and makes it look at the situation in a different light. So I do appreciate that. So I've also seen advice in the mold avoidance groups about the importance of simply finding a good environment. And what we really feel is important is controlling contamination. Why is it important to focus on finding contaminated items and getting them out of your living space, Erik?
Well, during the famous Tahoe outbreak, the teachers were getting sick by their exposure in the schools. The casino workers were getting sick at work, not at home. So what good is it, and why is it necessary to flee the entire environment if what's making you sick is at work, and either you can find a new job or break the chain of contamination so you're not bringing home whatever that agent is. Now, I'm still in the same place, and I know there's places around here that still have enough of this agent that if I were to work at it, I could go there and I could make myself sick again. And if I were careless about carrying this contamination home, I'd be sleeping with it. It would get on my bedding, on my pillow. I'd be hailing it all night. And even though my entire environment may not be polluted, I would be getting enough dose just by the contamination of what's in my hair and what's on my pillow that it could send me down the power curve and I would lose my gains. So rather than flee the environment, live in a tent in the desert, as I'm often accused of doing, I can control contamination, and I can be just as well as if I were living in the desert, because in between these source points, I'm fine.
That seems to be what us who are hypersensitive and what we go through. It's like we have this continuum of we always have to be on our toes controlling this contamination and, watching out for bad environments because we can hit this level of, going down on the power curve where we start feeling worse. But it's like as long as we know what we need to do, we can get back up on the power curve and be able to withstand these things and also navigate our environments. And I think if I were avoiding toxins and everything, I would probably be living in a bubble and would never want to leave that bubble. And
Yep.
so I think looking at this from the effect has really freed up my life and has brought back some normalcy to my life because I feel like I'm not afraid to go into environments anymore because I have a strategy. And that strategy is focusing on the effect. And we talk about this extensively in our class that we recently taught, the 4 stages of strategic mold avoidance. And that is also found in our private members group. You can check us out on exposingmold.com. Patreon.com/exposingmold. You can sign up and get access to that class. It's such an invaluable piece of information because it makes the world seem less scary and it gives you much more hope that you can actually live normal. You just have to employ these different strategies. People have children and they carry around diaper bags. Well, I have my mold avoidance bag where I have different, bunch of clean clothes and my water bottle and baby wipes. So that way I can decon if I ever get into a bad environment. And I really do appreciate you for this, Erik, because I think if I were following the advice of other groups where it's focusing on toxins, I don't think I would reach this level of comfort in my life to be able to live freely. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a bitter irony that people criticize mold avoidance, saying that we're living in fear, when actually it's the opposite. We're the fearless ones who are taking control of our situation, whereas they're the ones talking about having to live out in a totally pristine environment and are afraid to go into buildings, whereas we do so freely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we were in Incline Village in some of the most terrible spots this weekend, right, Erik? And it was like, all right, I felt some badness. All right, time to change my clothes. We made you even change your t-shirts because we felt it on you. But it's like, it's these simple things that you can employ that like literally are life changing. And I think I wish more people would be on board. And I hope more people after they see this will be a little bit more open-minded to this and would be more willing to learn more about the effect. I know it is pretty intense. You're talking about physics, you're talking about electrostatic surface energy, and all these words are so foreign to the average person, but it just makes a lot of sense. And from what I know, we're the only group talking about mold and mold avoidance and hypersensitivity in this manner. No one else is. And so you're really paving the way here, Erik, with all your research that you've done in the past 35 years. If it was a toxin, I'm sure that's what you would be talking about. This is a toxin issue and not an effect issue. And so I think people really just need to realize that Erik has really put the time and effort, and he's such a brilliant person and a person with military experience, a person in which every other mold expert or mold avoidance expert has derived their business, their ideas from. So what better way than to go back to the person who thought up that information? He would be definitely the number one resource to go to. Not those that are parroting him. So I just wanted to kind of give a little practical piece of advice for those who are hypersensitive. How to know if an item is contaminated, Erik? What can people do? What is a practical piece of information or an experiment that people can conduct to kind of rule out a contaminated item in their environment?
Well, prior to getting clear, people tend to be masked. So they're in a protective mode where they not only don't sense things, but there's a delayed response. And for some reason, after we get clear for a certain period of time, we go through an immunological reprogramming where the reaction time becomes instantaneous. And unfortunately, it seems to be necessary to get clear, to have a certain amount of recovery before you develop that ability. So the mold hiatus, the experiment of getting clear for a couple of months, is part of the process of learning how to do this. But once that's been accomplished, from that point on, you get near an object and you can tell right away. And the trick is to breathe on it, do a quick inhale, and see if you get a sensation of distress, air hunger, heart palpitations, brain compression, or just an alteration in mood. And if you do, trust your senses and regard it as being probably contaminated.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that tidbit of information. I hope you guys listening will conduct your own experiments. This is all about experimentation. You're constantly in an experimentation mode, assessing environments, being flexible, working on your toes. And really at the core of it, it's trusting yourself, trusting your body, trusting your senses, not just blowing off, oh, my heart is feeling weird. Oh, maybe I'm just stressed because I thought of something upsetting. No, really look at those physical symptoms and try to connect that to your environment. Try to connect it to something that may be causing issues. So that way you can take that out of your environment and lessen the burden of health damage. So thank you again, Eric. Thank you, Keely, for joining us. Everyone watching, I hope this wasn't too confusing. If you guys do have questions or want us to speak about the particular part in this segment even more, I'd actually love to do a segment with you, Eric, on hypersensitivity. Like, how did we get here? Why are we hypersensitive? I think that would be a great topic of discussion next time around. So again, if you have any questions, concerns, please send them in the comments section below. Let us know your thoughts on this. Was it too confusing? Anything. We just love feedback, and we're always looking to improve, and we're always looking to provide you with information that you guys need in order to survive in this crazy, crazy world. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, Eric.